Well, we're going to dive straight into our first story here. So, this is from Tennessee Conservative. U.S. government suing Tennessee to stop new law that protects children from life altering medical consequences. The federal government is suing the state of Tennessee to stop a new law that prohibits doctors from prescribing puberty blockers or cross sex hormones to minors and prevents gender surgeries before the age of maturity. Tennessee's law protects children from life altering medical consequences, but the Department of Justice claims the law violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, discriminating due to sex and transgender status. In a statement, Assistant U.S. Attorney General Kristen Clark said in a statement that no person should be denied access to necessary medical care because of their transgender status. Clark sent a letter to the state general attorneys all across the country last month, warning them about such discrimination. The case has been assigned to President Trump appointee U.S. District Judge Eli Richardson. Another Trump appointee, U.S. District Judge Thomas L. Parker, blocked a law protecting minors from sexualized drag shows last month. Governor Bill Lee, who called the lawsuit federal overreach at its worst, said in a statement that Tennessee is committed to protecting children from permanent life-altering decisions. So there's a lot to unpack there, but we'll go ahead and start those there. So Anastasia, we'll go to you for your initial reaction.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things when you sent this to us and I was reading this, that I think the sentence that sticks out to me the most is when she's quoted with saying, the word necessary sticks out to me a lot in that quote, necessary medical care. And I think we see this problem a lot with a lot of the problems we'll discuss tonight is it's very easy to put a Band-Aid over issues and not really focus on the root of who we are as human beings and what the real problem is. And that Band-Aid comes in the form of, it can come in the form of gun control, but it can also come in the form of gender surgeries and pills and all that kind of stuff. I mean, so Matt Walsh recently came to the University of Iowa out here, and all of these activists or protesters started flooding the hallway, and they were all screaming at us and a lot of obscenities, and it was hard. And the two women in front of me had been talking over this, and they were just like, this really bothers me. They were like, we've never actually been to an event like this. It's hard to even stomach them yelling at us. I mean, it can be hard when you're sitting there being yelled at and screamed at just because you want to hear somebody talk. And I told them, I said, honestly, the worst part for me isn't what they're saying or how they're acting. It's the fact that we care more about their futures than they do. And that's why we're here. And that's why we're learning about these things. I mean, obviously, surgeries and medication and all that kind of stuff is a Band-Aid over a problem that when you don't have a true savior at the root of your core, then everybody does what is right in their own eyes. Because when you don't have a true leader at the center and you don't have a true moral, when you don't have God, you have nothing. Honestly, nothing makes sense. And like I tell my dad all the time, it's like, when you realize that there is a God and that you are not God, that is really comforting. And it comes at a great times. So, I mean, it's disheartening and it's hard to hear, especially after so many people have come out and said that this doesn't help and that it helped them maybe for a year. And then after, when life starts to settle in and you're kind of out of that honeymoon phase, I guess you could call it, it's not easy anymore because you start to realize that you made a decision that you can never undo. And you start to realize that you're looking around at all these people like, I thought you guys were my friends. Like, shouldn't real friends tell you the truth? Like, I'd rather my friend look at me and be like, wow, you're being really, really dumb and it suck in the moment, rather than later on realize that I've made a decision that I can never come back from and be like, why weren't you there? So I guess that's kind of my initial reaction to that.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to be said about that, and we'll have to unpack some of that. But Jeff, what was your initial reaction?
Man, it has been several years now where we've lived in clown world, but some of this stuff, when you read it, it still feels surreal. It feels like living through a dystopia. I mean, it's so bracing to know we live in a world where people are pushing these kind of, what Anastasia said, these life-altering, irreversible decisions on children who have no capacity whatsoever to make a decision like that. I mean, the adults pushing it don't have the capacity to make a decision like that, let alone the children. And it, uh, you want to be like the caring Christian and compassionate and all that, but the same thing that she narrowed in on, that language of necessity, it's galling that they would use the language of objective truth in an endeavor that is entirely predicated on a plastic sense of reality that can constantly be molded. I think Ziggy Bauman called it liquid modernity. You can just always reshape reality however you want. But as soon as they need to borrow from a worldview that understands objective reality, they're happy to appropriate that language willy-nilly, no sense of needing to be consistent. And I mean, it makes me sad, but it also kind of makes the blood boil. I don't know what else to say, to be honest about it, other than to say it's just infuriating. These are monsters. They're straight up monsters, made in the image of God, lots of, all the human dignity that carries, but they've chosen a path of monstrosity. And I don't know how you can't just be kind of boiling about it.
Yeah.
We have a tendency in our culture.
Liquid modernity. I like that. Go ahead, Michael.
Sorry. It seems like we've got a consistency in the past 100 years or more where, in a medical sense, our culture doesn't know how to handle mental illness. It doesn't know how to address it, doesn't know how to treat it as well as it ought to be treated. And largely, I think that can be summed up to our lack of spiritual sensitivity and the work of the Holy Spirit, which is how we see it addressed in Scripture. But going back to the whole necessary medical treatment, how do we determine what is necessary when it comes to mental illness? And the problem here is that this isn't even being considered mental illness by those who would proclaim to be participants in it, but to the practitioners, it's treated largely in a similar fashion. And you would go to a psychoanalytical clinician to be diagnosed with gender dysmorphia or whatever diagnoses they're calling it now. What's interesting, though, is we call these transitional means like hormone blockers or even physical alterations to bodies are supposedly necessary. And yet, let's look back a few decades at when lobotomies were medically necessary. Or a few decades before that when, methamphetamines were used to cure headaches or, whatever it is. We can look at medical practices and what is deemed necessary. And oftentimes, things don't age very well. And I think this is one of those instances where we now are seeing it in live time, and it hasn't aged well in 10 minutes, let alone 100 years. It'll be interesting to see in our lifetime how this medically necessary transition implodes upon itself and damages people irreparably.
Well, to that point, again, the last 3 or 4 years, you've just seen every expert that we needed sort of sitting on the wall watching for dangers throw their credibility away for political points or whatever against their enemies. And my wife and I regularly talk about, we're doing more of our own research on medical stuff for our family because we feel like we've been abandoned by these institutions. It would be really nice to have a medical community that you could rely on to have sort of your best interests at heart. But they've made it crystal clear they're just going to chase the cultural winds. And so what are you left to do then, right? The experts you're supposed to depend on have told you very clearly, we have no interest in helping you. We have interest in using whatever you can bring to the table for us to push a political agenda. And it's just kind of cold out there. You wish you had people who are looking for objective care, but that's fast disappearing.
You expect that from politics, from politicians. You even expect that from the media, but it's much more disturbing when it comes from medical practitioners.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that caught a lot of people off guard, myself included, because my goodness, Richard just said, he said, Big Pharma hates us, period. COVID really exposed the lies that we all believed quietly. And yeah, that's honestly what it was. I wasn't even political until COVID. And now I'm more political than the average person by far, because I kind of took the deep dive into everything. And boy, it's shocking when you kind of lift up the lid. But Anastasia, what was your thoughts specifically about the DOJ stepping into this area?
I'm not like surprised at all. Like I think the cultural wins is a very good term to explain this, because like as you guys were discussing, it made me realize how many people are probably honestly afraid. I feel like a lot of people know the truth, but I feel like some of them are afraid because people are losing their jobs left and right just to stand up for truth and just to stand up for what they believe in, and like, I mean, take my dad, for example. Like, we don't all have conservative media platforms that we can step onto and fall back on when we're having to say the hard truths. Some of us have those everyday jobs where if we come out and we don't wear a mask, maybe, or we don't say somebody's pronouns, like we could just lose our job or not be friends with anybody anymore. And like I always say, and like I always like to remember, is for encouragement for anybody else out there listening, is my favorite Bible verse, which would be John 15:18. If the world hates you, know that they hated me first. And I find that really encouraging because it makes me realize that throughout standing for truth and throughout standing that, he did that and he got hated on just the same. So, but to answer the original question, it did not nothing really shocks me anymore, including this whole article, which is sad. I'm not saying that that's right, but it did not shock me at all.
Yeah, unfortunately. It's just interesting how this is the thing that the Department of Justice tends to focus on in today's day and age, when there's so much injustice going on right now in inner cities, and there's just so many other fish to fry. But apparently this is the most important thing too. And it's also bothersome too, because this is one of those examples where, if we're going to argue for states' rights, this is Tennessee laying out exactly what Tennessee believes. And it's very clear that the vast majority of Tennesseans would support, a ban on these kind of surgeries. But of course, the DOJ has to insert themselves wherever they feel they should. And that's unfortunate. But Jeff, what was your thoughts in regards to the Department of Justice and just the idea of the abuse of justice in general?
Well, I go back to the fact that we have no institutions that we can trust. If you look at all the important institutions that have kind of shaped American civic life over the years, again, sort of the medical community, government, military, intelligence, even I'm a pastor, church institutions, Roman Catholic Church, every one of them is in a crisis of credibility among normal, sane people. And so we talk about things like the fall of Rome, where the barbarians come sweeping in and life changes and all that. We're living in a fallen society. There's no institution that is contributing positively to, I say no, I guess y'all feel free to contradict me on that, but you can't look at any of the traditional institutions and saying they're actually helping society cultivate humanity. In fact, they're going the other way. And so when you look around and you think, well, society hasn't fallen because stuff doesn't look like Mad Max. We just have a very comfortable dystopia. Nobody's, we don't have cannibals marauding yet, but there's no, the emperor has no clothes in every area of institutional authority. And I guess my personal bent is sort of no king but Christ. So I may have an anti-authoritarian streak, but I believe that institutions were important. And I'm not rejoicing in any of this because it literally hurts people. It hurts our neighbors that we're called to love in the name of Christ. And it's a disgusting environment to sit in. And it's also kind of unprecedented because we have all the benefits of a technologically advanced society with no institutions doing what they're supposed to do. So it's disorienting. You think, well, at least I still get 2-day shipping from Amazon. But over here, the Department of Justice is weaponizing, mutilating children over and against the state's rights. It's bizarre.
Yeah, it is. To your point about the institutions, actually, first I should make a point about what you said about the comfort. I really do think that we expected 1984, but we got Brave New World instead. This is much more of a dystopia where we sedate ourselves into inaction and we sort of just check out from the public square in general. But to your point about the institutions, I think one institution that is still doing, a decent job. I'm not going to give them an A+ by any means, but that's the Supreme Court. And honestly, a lot of that's just because we had people that took bold action to get the right judges across the finish line, and that took a whole bunch of people stepping into the arena. And I think that it just goes to show that when you step into the arena, you truly can make a difference, because we would not have the conservative Supreme Court that we currently have. And to be honest, that's been a huge lifesaver when it comes to some of the crazy executive orders and legislation that was passed the first couple of years of the Biden administration. So I do think that that's really interesting. And to me, it just proves why we need good Christian people to step up into the public square more often.
Well, it's a fair point about the Supreme Court. I think I'm probably guilty of lumping the federal government into just this gestalt, and not differentiating. But you're right, and praise the Lord for the Supreme Court. I need to remember to be grateful in these strange days, and so that's a good reminder. And of course, let's get more people into the public sphere, because if the government is really tasked with restraining evil, secularism can't define evil. I mean, what are we talking about? They're talking about mutilating children as necessary health care. Secularism can't know what good and evil is, because men suppress the truth and unrighteousness. So you sure better have some Christians doing that, or we're going to keep calling good evil and evil good. Yeah.
Unfortunately. Michael, what was your take on the Department of Justice?
Well, it's interesting. I certainly hearken to what was already said about this, but I spent the bulk of my day today writing an essay on sociopolitical ethics, in which I wrote about justice and defined it and discussed precisely this to a certain extent, and what justice is and what it isn't. And ultimately, it's Bruce Birch, I'll use one of the quotes I used in my essay, says that it's God's justice that models the practice of justice in the human community. Justice is a divine attribute alongside holiness, righteousness, steadfast love, and compassion. And what those attributes have in common is that they cannot be done perfectly by man, because they are divine attributes, if we're to look at it that way. And what we're left with is a certainty that we cannot have absolute perfect justice through any human institution. Now, that puts us at a distinct disadvantage, since we're in this position in life where we're not yet in the glorified return of the King, and we don't have the institution of divine justice fully consummated in our culture. So what do we do in the meantime? And what it comes down to is something that I think we've discussed many times on this podcast, is that as Christians, as believers, as principled, ethical people, we are obligated to participate within the democratic republic that we have the ability to do, and speak so that we are not a silent majority, if a majority at all. And if we are not, then certainly we will submit ourselves to the governing authority insofar as it does not betray our holiness. But right now, the position that we're in is exactly why we're putting a podcast like this together, is to raise awareness and have more voices speaking the quiet part out loud and saying, this is insane. That, for one, it's insane, the entire argument that this is predicated on, that patients of severe mental illness may not be restricted from damaging themselves irreparably, is a pretty disturbing thought. That's that dystopia that we were discussing. But aside from that, the Department of Justice would act against the autonomy of the state. If our political system is going to operate as it is intended to, then the people should be able to have a voice, and the ethics of the people should be able to prevail in spite of the authoritarian powers that be.
Yeah. Now, playing devil's advocate, I'm sure the left wing would probably say that this is something that maybe the right wing would say about abortion, which is that, this is a violation of human rights. So therefore it's not a states' rights issue. This is when the federal government needs to come in and intercede because those human rights are being violated by the state of Tennessee. So what would your response be to that?
Well, as it pertains to abortion, it's wildly different, of course, because you are acting upon a third party in abortion. The victim of the medical practice is not one who can speak for themselves. Maybe there is something to be said from a more staunch libertarian perspective to say if people want to mutilate their bodies, then maybe they ought to be able to do so. I think that's a disturbing reality, but what puts it closer into the abortion perspective is that the individuals that are largely being protected by the legislation in Tennessee surrounding these topics are children who are more impressionable and susceptible to persuasion by their mental health clinicians and by their teachers at school, or even by social media itself, saying that, oh, if you feel this way, then you should go ahead and start taking drugs to alter what's happening in your body. And as a way of protecting the innocence of individuals who do not yet have the capacity to realize the implications of those actions, then yeah, I think that's where it comes down to, is a consenting adult having medical intervenience acted upon them because of their gender dysmorphia is a very different situation than a child who is not allowed to drink or get tattoos, but is allowed to be prescribed hormone blockers and gender altering procedures.
If I may, can I throw something out there really quick? That's just,
Please.
it's more so just like a thing that's been on my mind recently, honestly, as we're listening to all this. Like, I never think that we should stop standing for truth or like standing against, like, I never think we should stop standing for good. But sometimes when I hear discussions or when I hear people go back and forth, I honestly feel like we have laid all our cards on the table. And at this point, we need to be out here, trying to just bring people to the love of Christ and bring people to church. And that's nothing against anyone at all, because these discussions are important. But it's more so for me because I'm a lot like my dad, and I'm very confrontational. If you've never seen him, then you need to go just watch a 5-second clip, because I'm sure you're going to get the vibe. But, I don't shy away from confrontation, but I look at all these children, when I went to, and I hate to bring this back up again, but when I went to Matt Walsh's event and seeing all those kids, honestly, because I'm 22, but I don't know about you guys. I still sometimes feel like I'm young and I'm still a kid. But I see all these kids and I see all these young people, and it honestly just makes me sad, because I feel like no adult in their life is loving them enough to look at them and say, I'm sorry, sweetheart, or I'm sorry, honey, this just ain't it. You're just not right in the situation. Just because you feel this way doesn't mean that feeling is correct. Like, it makes me sad, because these are all the kids when they were younger and they wanted a cookie and they didn't eat their dinner first, and their parents were like, of course you can have like as many cookies as you want. You're always right. Like, now they're grown up. Like when all these kids were at the Matt Walsh event, like they were all led by this like 60-year-old man. And I'm like, who didn't bring you to church? Like, who didn't show you love and tell you that maybe your just point of view just ain't it, buddy? You know what I'm saying? So like, I that's just a thought that I've been thinking recently. And it's not to say that we shouldn't stand up for truth or that these facts don't matter. It's just to say that sometimes I feel like all of our cards are on the table. And the best thing next we can do is just say, do you want to come to church with me? Or do you want to maybe read this? Or do you want to hear this? Or look at this video? Or hear this sermon? Or see this podcast? You know what I'm saying? So it's just, I don't know, maybe I sound crazy, but that's just a thought that I've been thinking more recently.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think we need to be more bold about our faith in general. In fact, I listened to a great sermon at my own church. We had a guest speaker come in, and he was talking about how we have a bad habit as Christians of just hoping that if we appear to be nice and have it all together, that's going to be our witness to someone. And he kind of told a story of a unbeliever who basically called out his believing boss. He said, "Really, you were a believer this whole time? Like, and here I was thinking I was okay because I was just a decent person, because you were just a decent person too. I didn't know anything that was, different between you and I." But that's the reality, is we need to not just let our positive attitude and our joyful spirit be our only witness. Sometimes we do have to actually get verbal with that. So Jeff, I was thinking about what Anastasia was saying. Have you encountered a lot of individuals wrestling with these things while working in a pastoral role?
No, I've not ran into a lot of gender dysphoria. What I've ran into mostly was Christian students who experience some kind of same-sex attraction, and they're wanting to know, like, man, what do I do about this? But no, not gender dysphoria thus far. Now, my little town in Cookville is having to deal with that because there's been a controversy. There was a drag queen event at Tennessee Tech, a student organization. Thank God the president of the university said that's not going to happen on campus anymore. They moved the performance to a brewery near downtown. Well, that violated a city ordinance that events like that couldn't be held in some sort of proximity to a church. The church said, "Hey, we would like that not to take place." The DA declined to. What I'm told, the DA told the police force, "Look, I'm not going to prosecute this. So if you try to arrest people for trying this event, I'm not going to touch it. So you better let it go on." The event went down. They brought Antifa in for security. I mean, it just brought chaos to this local community that wants nothing to do with this on the whole. But there's this small little nugget of activists that want to change the world and demand everybody else go along with them. And we're still seeing ramifications. So the pastor who tried to throw his body in front of this craziness, Easter, a bunch of drag queens showed up and sat on the front row. I think they thought they would cause a spectacle for their Easter services. So I'm not dealing with it directly, but it's roiling my community in this little red state, near Mayberry kind of setting. The progressives won't leave anything alone. They have to have absolute allegiance or eradicate all dissonance. And if we don't get that through our heads, I don't think we're going to realize what's happening. And that's important because we're called to love our neighbor. It is loving to my neighbor to throw my body in front of this nonsense. And if I don't realize these elements, maybe not self-consciously, but nonetheless are objectively trying to destroy my neighbor, I'm not going to think through this the way I should be. And I wish I could kind of drop that into the evangelical brain. Like, you're supposed to love God and love your neighbor, and these people want to destroy every opportunity you have to do that. How should you respond to something like that?
Right. Well, the one nice thing is the encouragement from that is, just like there's that small minority who is pushing for big change, and they make a lot of ground even as a small minority in this area. At the same time, that a counter force can do just as much in the opposite direction, and that should be a bit of an encouragement